Hey, 42 here. On the 4th of April 1922, 6 bodies were discovered on a small Bavarian farm known as Hinterkaifeck, about 40 miles north of Munich. It was a tragic and shockingly brutal event, but if that's where this story ended, I probably wouldn't be making a video about it 100 years later. It's a sad reality of the modern world that people get murdered quite a bit, about once per minute globally, according to the World Health Organization. So why am I making a video about 6 murders on a small Bavarian farm 100 years ago? Well, because what happened that night is quite simply one of the most chilling and downright baffling crimes in history, with some very strange twists along the way. And by the end of this video, you'll uncover what footprints in the snow, a missing key, and an incestuous relationship have in common. But first, I want to ask you a question. What would you do if you heard strange noises coming from your attic? Well, that's exactly what Hinterkaifeck Farm's live-in maid reported about 6 months before the murders. Old farmhouses aren't exactly known for being quiet places, but these sounds were different, disturbing even. Footprints, scratching, tapping. It was almost as though someone was secretly living in the attic. That someone, if he or she ever existed, was never found, but the maid was so frightened she quit her job on the spot, never to return. Fast forward 6 months to just a few days before the murders, and the farm's owner, a man called Andreas Gruber, found a set of footprints in the snow leading from the nearby forest to the farm. Again, a search of the premises didn't turn up any mischievous murderers playing the world's least funny game of hide and seek, but they didn't find any footprints leading away from the farm either. That night, the entire family heard strange noises coming from the attic, and the following day Andreas Gruber noticed that one of his house keys had gone missing. More on that in a minute. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, with thousands of classes led by industry pros across film, illustration, design, freelance, productivity, and more. This new year, invest in yourself and your goals by starting a learning journey on Skillshare to take your career, your skills, or your side hustle to the next level. If you're not sure where to start, then Skillshare has designed learning paths to help you get from novice to pro in no time at all. Learning paths are curated sequential class collections to master a specific skill or competency. With learning paths, you can know exactly where to start your learning journey. Skillshare has curated high-quality content in the category of your choice, so you have clear direction to achieve your goal, and you'll discover new-to-you teachers. Each learning path is curated by category and includes classes from a variety of teachers to help you discover new industry pros to learn from. Recently, I've been trying to level up the animation in our videos, so I've been following the learning path, go from idea to finished animation as a beginner. It's been an absolute blast and a game changer for my animation skills. For me, following a learning path instead of blindly choosing a course ensured that my learning was efficient and directed. The first 500 people to use my link will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so don't miss out. The link's in the description. And a big thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. A few days later, on the 31st of March, Maria Baumgartner arrived at Hinterkaifeck. She was to be the Gruber family's new maid. You know, to replace the one that quit her job in terror 6 months earlier. Yeah, I'm guessing they didn't mention that in the interview. We've all heard horror stories about bad first days at work. You might have 1 or 2 yourself. But I don't think anyone can top Maria Baumgartner's, because that very night, she and all 5 of her new employers were brutally murdered. Exactly what happened is still unknown, but from what we can tell, the murderer hid in the barn, then somehow lured 4 members of the Gruber family to his location, one by one. Andreas Gruber, his wife Casilia, their daughter Victoria Gabriel, and her daughter, also called Casilia, were later found dead on the floor of the barn. Their bodies were stacked on top of each other, one by one. From there, the killer moved into the farmhouse, where he murdered the new maid in her bedroom. 2-year-old Joseph Gabriel, Victoria's youngest child, was found dead in his cot. All 6 of the victims were killed in the same way, bludgeoned over the head with a blunt object. So far, so horrific, and combined with the noises from the attic and footprints in the snow, it's all pretty bloody weird too. But what happened next is stranger still. It was 4 full days before the bodies were discovered. That in itself isn't particularly surprising, the farm was relatively remote, But what is surprising is the fact that several witnesses reported seeing signs of life there in the days after the killings. The evening after the murderers, local carpenter Michael Plockle passed by the farm on his way home from work. He remembered seeing smoke coming from the chimney and a man carrying a torch walking around the yard. 2 days later, mechanic Albert Hoffner spent more than 5 hours on the farm fixing a diesel engine. Andreas Gruber had booked the appointments the previous week. Hoffner didn't see a soul whilst he worked, but when he left, he did notice that someone had opened the door to the barn and tied up the family dog near the front door. Police would later find that, in the days after the murders, someone had been tending to the farm's animals, milking the cows, feeding the dog, that sort of thing. There was also evidence that meals had been prepared and consumed in the farm's kitchen. Considering all members of the Gruber family were well and truly dead at this point, there's only one real conclusion we can come to here. After murdering 6 people in cold blood, the killer continued to live on the property with his victims for 4 days, just being a farmer. The things people did before Stardew Valley. Okay, it's time to ask that most important of questions. What kind of sadistic maniac could have done such a thing? Suspicion first fell on the Gruber's closest neighbor, fellow farmer Lorenz Schiltenbauer. It was he, along with his friends Michael Poll and Jakob Sieg, who first found the bodies on the afternoon of the 4th of April. They'd gone to check on the family after realizing nobody had seen them for several days. Rumor has it Schiltenbauer was in a relationship with one of the victims, Victoria. But the real reason police suspected he was involved is because, according to official statements from Poll and Sieg, he'd acted really bloody weird when he found the bodies. The first course of action for most people upon finding 4 dead bodies piled up in a barn would be to throw up all over their own shoes. Not Lorenz Schiltenbauer. Nope. He decided to move them around a bit to get a better look at them. Apparently showing no particularly strong emotions, he then headed into the farmhouse, unlocking the front door with a key he produced from his own pocket. Poll and Sieg tried to stop him on the grounds that they shouldn't disturb any evidence that might be useful to the police, but Schiltenbauer ignored them and just went in alone. When the police did finally show up the following day, he was even kind enough to present them with what he thought was the murder weapon, a pickaxe he'd found in the barn. I can only assume he was either very naive or very, very guilty. He was later questioned by the police for obvious reasons, but he justified his undeniably odd behavior by claiming he'd been frantically searching for his son. And this is where things start to get a bit complicated. Well, more complicated. You see, the paternity of 2-year-old Joseph Gabriel, the youngest victim, is unclear. His mother Victoria had been widowed 8 years earlier when her husband Carl died fighting in the First World War. That was a good 6 years before Joseph was born, so who was the father? Well, according to Lorenz Schiltenbauer, he was. Or at least that's what he claimed after the murders. Beforehand, he swore blind that he wasn't, although it's possible he was just trying to get out of paying child support. Either way, there's another strong contender for Joseph's father, Andreas Gruber. Yeah, that's Victoria's own dad. It was well known in the local community that Andreas and Victoria were involved in an incestuous relationship. They'd even been forced to deny it in court. Their accuser? Lorenz Schiltenbauer. I told you it was complicated. Schiltenbauer eventually dropped those charges, and it seems that they all kissed and made up afterwards. Sorry, poor choice of words there. But when he later asked permission to take Victoria's hand in marriage, Andreas Gruber refused. Yeah, I don't know why he wanted to marry the woman he thought was sleeping with her own father either. Basically, it's all one big incestuous mess, and we'll likely never know all the details. The important thing here is that there may well have been a pretty powerful motive for murder buried in there somewhere. Did Lorenz Schiltenbauer believe Joseph was his, only to find out Andreas was really the father? It's certainly possible. Add that to the other evidence against him, and it isn't hard to see why Schiltenbauer was suspect number 1. But question marks still remain. Arguably, the most compelling evidence against him is the fact he seems to have deliberately tampered with the evidence when the bodies were discovered. But just think about it. If he really was the killer, he would have had a full 4 days to prepare the scene. It makes no sense whatsoever that he would have waited until there were witnesses to try and cover up his tracks. And if he really was Joseph's father, which is perfectly possible, his actions that day actually make a lot of sense. because he would have been absolutely frantic trying to find his son. Seeing a pile of bodies in the barn, he would have had to make sure Josef wasn't amongst them. And after confirming the boy wasn't in the barn, he would have headed straight for the house. Waiting around for the police to show up just wouldn't have been an option for him. Then there's that key. Again, it seems quite suspicious at first, considering we know one had just gone missing. But it isn't exactly unheard of for people to give their neighbours spare keys. And if Schiltenbauer really was in a relationship with Victoria, then it's even more reasonable that he would have had a key to the farm. Whatever the truth, the police were ultimately unable to find enough evidence to formally charge him, though he would fight accusations that he was the killer for the rest of his life. There are plenty of unknowns surrounding the Hinterkaifeck case, but one thing the police have been fairly certain of all along is that the killer knew the family well. Nothing was stolen, so it couldn't have been a robbery, and the way the Grubers were systematically eliminated seems to suggest a deep-seated personal vendetta rather than a random act of violence. That's obviously narrowed things down quite a bit, and believe it or not, for a while it led to one of the leading suspects being a dead man. We already know that Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, died 8 years before the murders whilst fighting in the First World War. But there's something interesting about his death that I haven't mentioned so far. His body was never recovered. And that got people wondering, was it possible that Carl Gabriel didn't die in the war after all? That he returned home after an 8-year absence to find his wife had had a child with another man, possibly her own father? Combine that nasty shock with a healthy dose of trauma from the trenches, and who knows what the prodigal son-in-law might have been capable of. Okay, admittedly that does all sound a bit far-fetched, but police at the time actually took this theory extremely seriously. Not only would Carl Gabriel have had a strong motive, him being the killer would also have explained some of the weirder elements of the case. After all, it's very hard to imagine why a killer would ever willingly choose to live in his victim's house after committing the crime, unless it was actually his house too. It was an interesting theory, but ultimately, it's almost certainly not true. The police were able to track down many of Carl's fellow soldiers from his time in the war, and several offered matching descriptions of when, where, and how he died. The fact his body wasn't recovered might seem suspicious at first, until you remember that 10 million soldiers died during the First World War. There's also the fact that one of the victims in the Hinterkaifeck murders was Casilia Gabriel, who, so far as we know, was Carl's own daughter. Whilst the safe money is on Carl definitely not being the killer, about 30 years after the murders took place in the early 1950s, a German newspaper published a series of stories about the case. Tucked away amongst them was a report claiming that several witnesses saw a mysterious stranger in the woods near the farm in the days leading up to the murders. This unidentified man appeared to be spying on the family. And how's this for an interesting little detail? He was apparently wearing a military uniform. During the course of the investigation, the police considered more than 100 different suspects, but every single one of them turned out to be a dead end. It didn't help that the investigation itself was a bit of a shambles. Actually, it was a lot of a shambles. After the crime was first phoned in, it was more than 3 hours before the Munich police force dispatched any officers to the scene, and this crack team of top detectives then somehow managed to drive to the wrong farm entirely. By the time they arrived at Hinterkaifeck, dozens of locals had turned up to see what all the fuss was about. Some sources even claim Lorenz Schiltenbauer was giving guided tours of the bodies, and there are several reports that someone had made themselves a bite to eat in the kitchen. Many of the forensic techniques in use today hadn't been invented back then. But even the ones that had weren't actually used. Fingerprinting was standard practice at the time, but for some reason none was carried out on Hinterkaifeck, and the detective inspector in charge of the case only spent half a day at the scene. Just 5 crime scene photographs were taken, and the property was searched so poorly that it wasn't until Hinterkaifeck was demolished a year later that the real murder weapon was found, a mattock that had been hidden beneath the floorboards on the ground floor of the house. Over the decades, multiple Munich police chiefs would have a go at cracking the case, but hampered by a lack of evidence, it remains unsolved to this day. Not that people have given up trying. In 2017, almost 100 years after the murders took place, American author Bill James and his daughter Rachel published a book called The Man from the Train, which investigates a series of apparently unrelated murders that took place in the US between 1898 and 1912. I say apparently unrelated because it turns out there were quite a lot of similarities between the crimes. In most cases, the killer murdered an entire family in their relatively remote home. He killed by striking his victims over the head with a blunt object, usually one he found at the scene. And he had a curious habit of stacking the bodies when he was finished with his bloody work. Sound familiar? The Man from the Train isn't about Hinterkaifeck at all, but the authors make the connection right at the end, and for a good reason. You see, the man they believed committed the murders in America just so happens to have been a German immigrant and ex-soldier called Paul Mueller. According to the book, Mueller's last American victims were killed in Iowa in 1912. By that point, the authors believed he'd murdered around 50 people, and they theorized that worried the US cops were onto him, Mueller fled back to Germany. If that's the case, it's certainly possible that he was indeed the Hinterkaifeck killer. It's a genuinely intriguing idea. The details of these crimes really are eerily similar. The timelines roughly match up, and it's a funny old coincidence that Mueller was German. But the truth is, there's no evidence that he ever went back to Germany. Until we find some, this one's still just a theory. These days, famous cold cases tend to attract their fair share of internet sleuths, and Hinterkaifeck is no exception. For the most part, these digital detectives have focused on one aspect of the case that police seem to have largely overlooked: the strange goings-on at the farm in the lead-up to the murders. Between the footprints in the snow, the noises in the attic, and the missing house key, it isn't hard to imagine that the killer, whoever he was, had been living on the farm in secret for some time before the murders. Could it have been a drifter who took shelter on the farm, then decided to murder the Grubers after learning all of their Gruby secrets? Again, it's a nice theory, but again, there's scant concrete evidence to support it, and the same can be said for pretty much all the other theories too. The truth is, we may never know what exactly happened on that farm 100 years ago. Too much time has passed, and too little evidence has survived. One thing's for certain, though: the Hinterkaifeck murders are one of the most disturbing and morbidly fascinating unsolved crimes in history. My final question to you is this: who do you think did it? Thanks for watching. Just a quick word to say that I couldn't make these videos without the support of my Patreon members. Consider joining the exclusive 42 Discord community by supporting me on Patreon. It's a great place to discuss my videos with like-minded individuals and myself. The link's in the description, but if you don't want to, or you can't join my Patreon, then please don't worry. A simple like or comment to say thanks would also put a huge smile on my face. Thank you.